And we're recording.
Great.
I'm admitting more people. And before, Rabbi, you start, this is like, your commercial break. Tonight is our anti-racist book club, and it's with Tani Prell, and we're doing the book Between Two Worlds by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Even if you haven't read it, I think you'll enjoy it, but that's just me. Rabbi will tell you what we're watching next week. Rabbi Evan has his book group is on his class is on Monday and Wednesdays. Ecclesiastes, woo, I learned how to say it. Kohelet, and all of this is in your My Macomb at home. And if you ever have any problems, just give me an email and I'm happy to help you out.
And I think Rabbi Evans teaching that class again with his dad, right?
Yes, you are absolutely correct.
So his dad, Steve Moffick, I've known him for 25 years or more, and is a very teacher in his own right. So I encourage you to study the book of Ecclesiastes, which is a fascinating and strange book. Almost didn't make it into the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes, which may have come up in the class. I don't know, but in the recounting of the story of how the Bible comes to be in the Talmud, the rabbis find the book of Ecclesiastes objectionable. And then one of the rabbis takes into his study for a while and then comes back, and everybody agrees it should go into the Bible. So no one actually knows what was removed Ecclesiastes to make it more palatable to the rest of the rabbis. But what's left is one of the later books of the Bible that's heavily Greek philosophy. So it's a very interesting book. So I encourage you to study with us every day. So, but it's my pleasure to do something that's lighter than what I've been doing for the last several months, and talk about movies a bit, which is a love of mine, and so strangely something that's in my background that has become more important in recent weeks and months with all the that we're having to do today. So my undergraduate degree is in radio, television, and film. So you may not know that when I applied to rabbinic school, my safe school was USC Film School. So that was just in days. And my professor at the University of Wisconsin, who is now the host of the Criterion Channel, if any of you are watching, these arty films on but he still says that my recommendation to rabbinic school is the only rabbinic school recommendation he ever wrote as a professor of decades at the University of Wisconsin. Anyway, so movies are certainly a great love of mine, and something that I studied seriously in college, and things that I learned there will be part of what we're talking about now, which is really just to see movies as a text like you would any other that you analyze, right? If you look at a poem and try and understand its meaning, and look at the way things are done. We'll do some of that with these films as well. So so the movie that we start with, I mean, it's a good starting place for talking about Jews in movies and real Jewish classics. Talking about, it's certainly not the first to be made on Jewish themes. You probably know, and I think we're going to look later in our class at The Jazz Singer from 1927, widely considered to be the first full-length talking film, although we'd have to take that phrase apart when we look at it a little bit. But that's the story of a cantor's son, and leaving his Jewish home and becoming a part of the American idiom. So The Jazz Singer from 1927 is certainly a movie on Jewish themes, and even if you go back to the silent era, there are silent versions of some of the great Jewish folk tales, like the Golem, for example, and Dybbuk, which is based on a Yiddish language play. And yet, even though there were these films on Jewish, there's a period of time from the 30s to the late 40s where there are not so many film themes, even though the producers of many of these films, certainly the heads of the big studios out in California at this point, were all Jews, almost all Jews. You know, we'll see a couple of exceptions as we talk about the movie that we're seeing, that we're talking about today and talking about next week. But the biggest studios, the heads of them were people like Harry Cohn at Columbia, Sam Goldwyn at Paramount, Louis B. Mayer at MGM, Warner Brothers, of course. So all of these guys were, interestingly enough, in his book, An Empire of, I believe Neil Gabler writes about how not only are the heads of all these studios Jewish, but they all can trace their roots back to Stettin, Eastern Europe, that were less than 100 miles apart from each other. And so these guys come to America, end up in the movie business. They get to where they are in a variety of different ways, but they end up essentially running these studios. And one of their, their goal is certainly to make popular movies that will make money for them and for their investors and for everybody involved. But they also...
Will you let me back in? I'm having trouble hearing.
Absolutely. And while we're pausing, I'm here. I'll be here the whole time. I'll let people in. If you want to ask a question, Rabbi will pause, but you can chat me or virtually raise your hand and I'll let him know.
Okay. I'm going to restart my iPad.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
So while we're... so I was talking about these different moguls, but when it came to their Jewishness, they did not like to wear that on their sleeve, at least in public movies. So that the movie that we're looking at, that we're talking about today, Gentleman's Agreement, comes out in 1947. There have been relatively few movies with Jewish themes from that time around the jazz singer till here. There are some, and we'll talk about a couple of special ones as we go along. But in 1946, at the end of World War II, and we should that fact that this is where it happens, that after the liberation of the concentration camp, these things, there is perhaps a little more appetite to do something about anti-Semitism. We'll say that these movies, the Gentleman's Agreement and the movie that we'll talk about next week, Crossfire, they came out within a couple of months of each other. Both of them were nominated for Best Picture. Gentleman's Agreement wins. Crossfire does not. And after next week, we'll talk more about Crossfire and perhaps some of the reasons why win. But they were made, but not without some protest from some of the producers in Hollywood who thought that maybe it wasn't the best idea to bring attention to Jews and Judaism. That the best way for them to be involved was for Jews to go sort of under the radar and not really be exposed. And that actually making a movie about anti-Semitism, they were afraid, would contribute to anti-Semitism rather than to do away with it. Right? So that's kind of incorporated into the film itself. If you've watched Gentleman's Agreement, and this is where we get into this. So if you can spoil a movie that came out in 1947, I mean, if you haven't seen it by now, so you can, of course, see it. If you've seen it lately, it's worth another look. Most of these films are available through Amazon. A couple of them, so we'll make it clear as we go along. But so the producers, by and large, were concerned that this was not the best idea. Interestingly, the producer who makes Gentleman's Agreement is Darryl Zanuck, the head of Fox, one of the few non-Jewish studio heads at the time. There's some of this is perhaps an accident, it's deliberate, right? That for Jews to complain that there's anti-Semitism is expected. For Daryl Zanuck to complain anti-Semitism is not so expected. Daryl Zanuck actually told a story about how that he went to a resort with his wife and family and spent 2 hours trying to explain to the clerk that he was not Jewish. Right? So, and eventually was allowed to stay at this resort. But so it's a kind of a bizarre backwards sort of thing, because of course this too finds its way into the movie, where the character Gregory Peck plays deliberately goes to a resort that he knows is restricted, and say it, that they're restricted. Zanuck, his experience is that the expectation was that because he was his name, I suppose, the name Zanuck not being as clear as some others in terms of its derivation, and because it's associated with the movie business, so the clerk at the resort assumed that he was Jewish, right? But he's able to stay at this resort. So, so Zanuck was actually a Methodist. He was from Wahoo, Nebraska. He was a Republican, and he produces this movie. It's directed by Kazan. This is Ilya Kazan, of course, goes on to direct some remarkable movies like On the Waterfront in particular. Kazan's background was actually in New York as a stage director. He grew up actually. His family is of Greek origin. He was actually born in Constantinople, but his family came to America when he was 3 or 4 years old, and the name is shortened from the family's longer Greek name, Kazan. He eventually gets involved in the theater world in New York, in particularly working with what was then called Lee Strasberg's group theater. Later on, was the Actors Studio. He starts out there when he's quite young, and was directing Broadway and off Broadway by 1938. So, so it's interesting. One of the joys of seeing this movie, and perhaps you enjoyed it too, is seeing some of the location shots shooting in New York City in 1947. And the city looked like then. I will say that later in his career, in his autobiography, Ilya Kazan didn't much care for this movie in terms of his own personal resume of what he thought he'd done well and didn't do well. He didn't think of Gentleman's Agreement. He said a number of things about it. In his autobiography, he said, "So much, so horrible has been recognized about the attack on the Jews since the film was made, seems inadequate to the issue." He said that it lacks the intimate experience of someone who'd been through the bitter and humiliating experience. He also says that, and this is more to the aesthetic side of it, he says it looked like an illustration for Cosmopolitan. And he complained that he said that it seemed as if the characters in this movie never had to go to the bathroom, right? Which is his way of saying that the characterizations didn't live up to what he thought he got from actors in films, and coming from Strasberg and that kind of the method, the Actors Studio, the idea of method acting. Kazan is associated with Marlon Brando pretty early in his career. and is involved with him making, I think, Streetcar Named Desire in New York, and as well as, of course, On the Waterfront. And actually, the part that's played by John Garfield in this movie was offered to Marlon Brando for. Brando was just starting out as a young actor. John Garfield was a very established and popular actor. And John Garfield was nominated in the category of Best Actor in 1947, but not for this movie. It was for his movie where he plays a boxer, I think, called Body and Soul. And, so John Garfield's one of the few in this movie who's actually Jewish. So if you don't know, John Garfield's real name is Julius Garfinkel, and changed his name to John Garfield, and was a matinee idol at this point. So in this movie, he plays Dave, Gregory Peck's friend from military service, who shows up most of the time in this movie in uniform, right? So it's it's made it this interesting time right after the end of World War II. It is, Hollywood then and now still occasionally makes movies like this, a social drama, with a progressive theme, right? You can look at movies about the environment, for example, something like Erin Brockovich or something, often called issue films. And Ilya Kazan was made several of them around this time period. The couple of years before this, he made A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which perhaps you're familiar with. You're probably less familiar with the movie he makes after this one called Pinky, which is, I see Brenda's nodding her head. Maybe someone's actually heard of Pinky. And, it's a story about a light-skinned African-American who passes in white culture. So it doesn't go often these days, but so he was associated with a number of this kind of movie. Oh, we've got a nice picture of John Garfield.
Right, because sometimes you need the visual to remind you of who everybody is, and right. So
so feel free as like that. So John Garfield. I mean, it's an interesting. We have to talk about this a little bit today, and even week when we talk about Crossfire. That these kinds of movies, these issue films that were coming out of Hollywood, were under some scrutiny in DC. The House Un-American Activities Committee was really kind of getting started. The post-World War II Red Scare. I mean, so we're a little before, Joseph McCarthy really explodes onto the scene. But the Un-Activities Committee is very much at work and pretty much interviewed, indicted people involved in this film. So Ilya Kazan's story is perhaps best known, that he actually cooperated with the committee and named names of people that he suspected were communists in Hollywood. Others did not. So we'll talk about the director and producer of Crossfire next week. John is one of the guys who was blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Committee. By the way, Ilya Kazan started out at the Actors Studio as an actor, but after a few scathing reviews, decided that acting was not in his future. So he switched over to directing. There were a couple of things in a rather narrow that he seemed to get good reviews for, but I was unable to stretch and do other kinds of things. So John Garfield was actually blacklisted by the House Un-American committee, and he died quite young. It's a heart failure, but I think he was 39 years old, and it's just a couple of years after this. So he didn't sort of outlast the blacklist, unlike some of the other folks involved in some of these things. So the movie, as I said, produced and directed by non-Jews. In hopes, they thought, of calling attention to this issue. Was not involved in the issue, right? Similar to the character of Skylar Green himself, the character that Gregory Peck plays in the movie, that, who better, in a sense, to call attention, right? Again, as I said, if Jews call attention to anti-Semitism, that's not a news story, right? Skylar Green pretending to be Jewish, that's a story, right? And so that's where this comes from. The movie, of course, is based on a book. The author's name is Laura Z. Hobson. The Z stands for Zametkin. Was her maiden name. She did not use that in her writing. So there's a sort of all this question of changing your name. So in the movie Skylar Green, right, he says, well, yeah, it's really Greenberg, but I use Green, right? And of course, the real story of Julius Garfinkel, who becomes John Garfield, and so many others who changed their names, Benny becomes Jack Benny, and so on. I'm sure you can come up with at least a half a dozen of them if you think about it, right? So it was a best-selling book. One of the interesting things about Hobson and her family is that both her father is one of the first editor of the New York Daily Forward, Yiddish language newspaper, which was published daily on the Lower East Side of New York back in those days. Her mother was a columnist for a different Yiddish Jewish newspaper back in those days. So she comes from these not just journalistic Jewish roots, Yiddish roots, and writes this book, Gentleman's Agreement. She wrote several other books too, that some of which have been critically acclaimed over the years. So this is maybe due for a little bit of rediscovery. So think about that for some of our, because the producer Darryl Zanuck hires Moss Hart, the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, to write the play for Gentleman's Agreement. Moss Hart is Jewish, so he writes the screenplay, and then it's a cast, right? Gregory Peck is already a matinee idol when he takes on this role. It's several years before Mockingbird, but he's already a star. In some of the smaller parts, of course, we mentioned John Garfield, Celeste Holm, who was a big Broadway star as well as a movie star. I mean, she was in the original cast of Oklahoma. I think it's, what's the actual name of that song? I'm just a girl who can't say no. I mean, that was Celeste Holm on Broadway. Later on, she was in All About Eve. She was in the movie High Sea. So she plays, of course, in this the kind of the name of the character is Anne, and she is kind of that wisecracking society columnist on the staff of the magazine. So she was still a kind of an up and coming star at this point. She won the Oscar for the Best Supporting Actress. And the other actress that was nominated for the Oscar this year for this same movie is Anne Revere, who plays Gregory Peck's mother in the movie, whose name in the credits is Mrs. Green. So I'm not really sure what her first name was, but she's just Mrs. Green. Interestingly enough, she's only about 10 years older than Gregory Peck. So even then in Hollywood, I mean, we talk about this now, but they to look a little bit older. I mean, I think the makeup leaves something to be desired, but they had to make her look old enough to be Gregory Peck's mother in the movie, but they wouldn't actually hire someone who was old enough to be Gregory Peck's mother. So rather peculiar. So that's Dean Stockwell in a different movie, right? Dean Stockwell plays Gregory Peck's son in this movie. He was a child star. Then there was kind of a hiatus, and then he kind of made a comeback. And so you may have seen Dean Stockwell in a number of things as an adult. I mean, he took on some rather unusual roles. For instance, in the movie Blue Velvet, he plays a role in that. If you watched the TV series Quantum Leap, that's actually I think a still Quantum Leap there, where he plays a hologram actually who appears to the main character from time to time. It's time travel. So a rather unusual career, but he did make a lifelong career after starting as a child star. The other two women that I mentioned, one is the one who plays the secretary to Skylar Green, has a nice scene. Her name is June Havoc, and so she's the one who explains to him how she changed her name and got the job. Right? She sent 2 letters to the magazine, one with her actual name and one with the name Elaine Wales. And Elaine Wales got the job, but under her Jewish name, she couldn't even get an interview. Right? We still talk about, of course, that someone did a study not long ago where sending identical resumes for jobs. Leave this one up for a minute. I want to show people this. But that African American sounding names are less likely to get jobs than anglicized names, let's say. But I did want to point out to you that June Havoc is the sister of Gypsy Rose Lee. She is Baby June, right? So if you're familiar with the musical Gypsy, right, and the song "Let Me Enter," it starts out with being the child singing it, right? It's Baby June, and June Havoc is Baby June. She did not have the career ultimately that her perhaps less talented sister Gypsy Rose Lee did, but she did all right, and shows up in a lot of films, and plays a small but significant part here in this movie. So the last of the actresses mentioned for this, of course, is Dorothy McGuire, who plays Kathy Lacey, the love interest, ultimately the partner to Skylar Green, and character, of course, is very important in this, as she represents perhaps more than anyone else this kind of a acquiescence, right? That is complicity in anti-Semitism, right? That she by not standing up neither to her sister or to the community, and there's a scene, of course, very close end where she talks to John Garfield's character Dave Goldman and tells him about how upset she was when someone anti-Semitic story at a dinner party she was at, and he says, "Well, what did you do?" And nothing, right? She, the description of her here is she's a quiet, passive beauty. That's exactly what she plays in this movie, right? She's in some way, she's a go-getter. It was her idea to do a story on anti-Semitism, but she doesn't think it applies to her, right? We would talk about white privilege, right? She is privileged to not have to deal with this, and so she doesn't stand up, doesn't speak out, right, until the very end, and that's bit of a deus ex machina, if you like. I mean, that conversation with Dave Goldman, she changes her tune, she changes her life, she offers Dave and his family the chance to live in her house that she doesn't live in a neighborhood where Jews are where there's a gentleman's agreement, which is where the title comes from. The Jews will not live there. And because she has this change of heart, she ends up being able to marry our main character, Skylar Green. Right? I'm not sure. I think the movie does, suggests that maybe Skylar picked the wrong horse. That that the Celeste Holm plays. I think the last line she has in the movie. I mean, he asks her, "Is that a proposal?" And she says, "Maybe." Right? So there's a sense that Celeste Holm was through the movie. It stands up more to the idea of anti-Semitism, is more woke, if you want to use modern technology again, than the character of Dorothy McGuire, right? Of course, you can't beat love at first sight, which I guess is what we see when Gregory Peck first meets her at the dinner party at his editor's home. So, um, there are some wonderful scenes in the film, some really thoughtful things. Scene, I think, where Gregory Peck has to explain anti-Semitism to his son. Is an interesting example of and a relatively clever way for Moss Hart to put this into the screenplay, right? Trying to explain to the audience as well as to this child what is anti-Semitism. Right? Anne Revere, playing his mother, has a nice line at the end of that. It would be nice not to have to explain it to our children someday. Right? So, of course, we know that even though this film was made in 1947, this is unfortunately something that still is happening in our society, still something that we have to explain to people. Whether or not it actually changed lives, changed our society, hard to say. These things do seem to have a way of ebbing and flowing, and we're in a flow than an ebb at the moment. But there was some research when the movie came out. People watched kind of a standard way to do research. It's been done on a number of films over the years. But so people are interviewed before they see the movie. They take a questionnaire. They see the movie, and then they take another questionnaire. And so there was a sense that even though people weren't that excited about seeing a movie about anti-Semitism back at this time, it's one of the arguments that some of the other production companies made making a movie like this is no one wants to see a movie about anti-Semitism. But once they saw the movie, they were more likely to recognize that anti-Semitism is a problem, and that it should and that something needs to be done about it. That, of course, is not the same thing as saying I recognize my complicity and I will, as the Kathy Lacey character comes to by the end, that she's not idly by while these things go on around her in this kind of a gentleman's agreement of Jews are fine as long as they don't come to the country club or to the resort or act too Jewish out. which is, I think, one of the criticisms of the film for me, is that there is not much Jewish about the Jewish character in this film, right? And that really the only difference between Skylar Green before and after, is putting his name on the mailbox in the apartment where he's living, right? So he changes it from Green to Greenberg, and that's all it. But we also, there's no hint for him or of Dave Goldman, the actual Jewish Jewish character in the movie, him actually going to a synagogue, doing anything that might be remotely considered to be Jewish, right? So the point of the movie on some level is Jews are just like us, which is true, but there's also a place to say, well, Jews are just like us, but they also do their Jewish things, right? And don't quite have that in this movie. So it's unfair sometimes to criticize a movie for what it's not doing, right? They had a wanted to tell, they told it. I think they told it pretty well. So, I want to open certainly to questions and thoughts. So if you've got something that you're thinking about, maybe you may wisdom about things. There's some hands up. Vanessa, are you going to do that?
Yeah. So Gary or Lynn, and then Susan.
And I see Barb too.
Oh, and Barb and Brenda. Okay, I'll write it down here.
Okay, great.
And Alice. Oh,
So, it's a 1947 movie, so I assume it was made probably in 1946.
Yeah.
Which says that it was made 1 year after the end of the Second World War.
Right.
After the horrors that Jews went through during the Second World War, to sort of take no cognizance of that and to sort of pretend that, okay, so we have a gentleman's agreement and, Jews are somewhat different, but can we all get together? It's just startling to me that thinking back on it, the movie seems so benign and so unwilling to take any kind of position.
Right. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Honestly, I do think that the Holocaust and the revelations of the total horror of the Holocaust is part of the impetus for a movie like this being made at all.
Right.
If it wouldn't have happened probably without that. The fact that it doesn't mention it at all, there's two schools of thought on this, I think. One is it takes a while before people process that horror enough to actually deal with it in an artistic way, right? So, in American films, you don't really see much about the Holocaust until the late 50s. It takes a good 10 years before make a movie like, Judgment at Nuremberg, right? It's one of the first films. 1953, there's a really interesting film. It's actually filmed in Israel, starring Kirk Douglas. It's directed by the director we'll talk about next week, Edward Dmytryk, called The Juggler, which actually has Kirk Douglas playing someone, a displaced person, right, from the Holocaust, who's finds his way to Israel in 1953. And I'm not sure that it was financed by a Hollywood studio, but it's definitely one of the earliest movies to deal with the Holocaust, and actually it's a pretty good film and a pretty interesting characterization, and there's some very poignant moments, of this character played by Kirk Douglas for his family in the various transfers from Europe to Israel. It's filmed on location in Israel too, so it's kind of a fascinating historic document. But he sees someone who he mistakes for his wife. I mean, there's no way that she could be. She's much too young to be his wife. I mean, he's living in a fantasy, in a sense, when he sees her. But it's a real attempt to deal with some of the psychological issues and horror that come from the Holocaust. But it takes years before people are ready to do that. So I think that's one school of thought, is that they simply were not able to comment in any sort of cogent and coherent way on the Holocaust at that point. The other argument is that it's more of a commercial one, right? And that's always the tension in a Hollywood movie. And, very few producers have ever made a movie that they don't expect to make money, right? So going too far out and being considered to be too strident on an issue, right, was something that they weren't willing to do. So that leads to the kind of homogenization that I think you're reacting to, Gary, in the film, is they don't want to be too strong. There'll be a little more of an overtone movie we watch for next week, but even that, I mean, it's kind of fascinating. So it's clear that both the Gregory Peck character and, of course, the John Garfield, who's in uniform, right, for part of this movie, that they served in World War, according to this, but it doesn't really talk about their service or what they saw or what happened or anything about the whole. It's interesting.
Okay, Susan is next.
Okay, Rabbi, in watching this movie again last night after not having seen it for very many years, it brought home to me when you talk about being complicit, that I think some of us as Jews have also in some way, certainly not wanting to be, but have been complicit ourselves, that when we hear anti-Semitic remarks or remarks that can be taken that way, we are too shy and we're afraid to say anything about it. And I can use myself as an example. Many years ago, when my husband was in the service, and we were part of a very large party of Gentile people, all Air Force officers and their wives. And we were the only Jews there. And they were discussing something. And one of the women came up with something, well, I tried to Jew him down.
Yeah.
And Dick and I both sat there and kind of looked at each other, but neither one of us said a word. And if that happened to me today, I would definitely not keep my mouth shut. I would say something. But in my youth and my worry about perhaps not being accepted, and I don't know what it was, or my shock, because I had never heard that expression before. I mean, I was 22 years old, but I'd never heard it. And I kept my mouth shut.
Yeah.
And when I think back on it, and the movie last night reminded me of that.
Right. So there is certainly among us a fear of making waves, right? And some of that still translates into that same thing that I think some of the producers, the other Jewish producers, felt in Hollywood back then, right? That calling attention to some is not always the best way to deal with it, right? So whether or not that's true, that's what they felt, right? That paradoxically, sometimes calling attention to anti-Semitism just amplifies the message, right? So, I mean, we dealt with some of this a number of years ago, for instance, when Mel Gibson made his movie about the Passion, which was one of the more anti-Semitic versions of the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, right? And there were real questions in the Jewish community about what's the best way to respond to something like this, right? It was ultimately a very popular film. And so being silent about it was probably not a good idea, right? So, but as Jews ourselves, we sometimes have to do that sort of delicate dance. I mean, thinking about what is the best way to respond to anti-Semitic things. I can tell you, teaching confirmation, I mean, one of the things I often ask the 10th graders is if they've ever felt anti-Semitism in their life. And I can tell you that every year, every single one of them says yes. Right? Even though they live in, our relatively cultural bubble, they have dealt with it, and certainly we've seen examples of it that some of you know about some of the local sports teams and what it's like to say be the hockey team from Highland Park playing in Lake Forest. Things happen, right? So it's still there, and it still requires us to step up, Susan, and to say something when these things happen. We don't necessarily have to see anti-Semitism in every single thing that happens all the time, right? But it's there. We do have to take it on.
It also happened, you're talking about the confirmation class.
Yeah.
Our daughter was a tennis player in high school, and the girls' tennis season was always in the fall. So every year she had to miss on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Yeah.
And one day I drove her to practice, and I could hear these girls. I happened to have had a convertible at the time. It was a beautiful day. And I drove her up, and she dropped her off. And these little girls standing around said, "Oh, look, if it isn't Marcy Wellick, it must not be a Jewish holiday."
Yeah.
And that, once again, I kept my mouth shut.
Right.
Shouldn't have.
Yeah. Okay, we have Brenda and then Alice.
Okay, I want to make a comment and then ask a question.
Sure.
The comment I want to make is I kind of think that even if the producer and director were Jewish, it still would have been a very similar movie, because I think most Jewish producers and directors at that time were not really that outgoing about their Jewishness. That's the comment I.
Yeah, they were very much about assimilation in those days.
Right.
To fit in.
And then the question I was going to ask is that, did any of the European countries, particularly France, did they have any films at that time dealing with anti-Semitism? Because sometimes they were ahead of us.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, there are some films that have some sympathetic Jewish characters in French films. I'm thinking by Jean Renoir, The Grand Illusion, for example, which is really actually about World War I, but filmed, I think, during World War II. So there are some movies like that, but I don't recall anything that specifically deals with anti-Semitism. And in terms of the Holocaust as well, I mean, it doesn't really European films until around the same time it starts showing up in American films, which is the late 50s, really.
Thank you.
There may be, of course, I mean, there's, no one can be an authority on every movie that there is. So, if someone knows of something, I'd love to hear about it, but not that I'm aware of.
Right. And Alice.
Okay, I found it interesting the way the movie was trying to show different points of view of Jewish people at that time, dealing with anti-Semitism and just dealing with life. And one of the ones I found very interesting, but I had some questions about it, was the scientist that they get, that Kathy and Skylar get introduced to at that party. And obviously he was Jewish, but he talks a little bit about Israel. I mean, he doesn't say Israel because there was no state of Israel then, but he says something about Palestine
Mhm.
I found that kind of an interesting, but then I got confused about what point he was trying to make about, because he kept saying something like, I don't believe, I don't do things,
Yeah.
but I'm Jewish. And I just am curious, Rabbi, like
Yeah.
what you think his character was trying to show us.
So there are three Jewish characters in this movie besides the one that John Garfield plays, right? And they each have something to say that's kind of important, and at least one of them comes out of this complaint from other producers that you shouldn't make a movie like this, right? That's the industrialist that he meets at the dinner, right? When he says he's doing a piece on anti-Semitism, he says, "Don't make waves, right? We're best, and you don't call attention to this." So that's one sort of we shouldn't bring this up. Makes things worse for us, right? The second thing is the secretary who changed her name to get the job, got the job, and now doesn't want the policy to change where she works because she doesn't want people, I'll use the language she uses in the movie. We don't want those kike kind of here, right? So it's okay to be an assimilated Jew like me, but those other kind right here, so that's a second one. And the third is the one that you mentioned, the scientist, who is loosely based on Einstein, right? Well-known Jewish scientist of the time, well-liked. There was talk about Einstein being the first president of Israel. He refused. Right? So the presidency of Israel, of course, has always been largely ceremonial. The prime minister is more like, and that the president has a ceremonial role, right? So, but I being made there is that he's Jewish because society won't allow him to be anything else, right? And so that's it. I mean, his Jewishness is defined not by him. If it was only defined by me, I don't practice, I don't go to synagogue, I don't say prayers, I don't believe in God, but everybody looks at me and says I'm a Jew, so I am, right? And I take pride in that, right? That's his Jewish consciousness, his Jewish pride, and I think it applies to a lot. Certainly a lot of non-affiliated Jews in our community, where it's. I think it was the philosopher Emil Fackenheim who talks about the 11th commandment. I think he was the one who started that thou shalt not give Hitler a posthumous victory, right? And so people who define themselves in their Judaism only by, right, not by joy or practice or even community, right? It's just this sort of ness that if society is going to label us, I'm going to wear that label, right? And I think that's what the scientist is telling us. On one level, that he has no choice, right? This is what, the label that society has put on him. But since that's the label that's put on him, that's the label he's going to wear, and he's going to wear it proudly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Brenda said the Kaiki comment often dealt with the difference between the German Jews and the Jews of Eastern Europe. And we have 4 more minutes. I want to show you that this is what the Crossfire, that's the one you should watch for next week, right?
Right. Yes. And also available on Amazon, I think, like this one, a small rental to see it. So just mention, so this film that we watched for today, Gentleman's Agreement, was 7 Oscars. it won the Oscar for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actress for Celeste Holm. Did not win, nor did Dorothy McGuire, who was nominated. And of course, they had 2 nominations in the supporting act category. And so the Mrs. Green, played by Anne Revere, did not win the Oscar. I mean, I do think it's probably hard if your character doesn't have a name, but that's a different, for a different day. It was also nominated for Best Screenplay.
It's like the women in the Bible.
Yeah,
Mrs.
the
Hall.
best adapted screenplay by Moss Hart. I think Miracle on 34th Street, which is a little bit ironic. I think you know, the best screenplay Oscar went to that one. I think the best supporting actor went to Edmund Gwenn, who played Santa Claus in that movie, right? So looking ahead at Crossfire was nominated for many of these same awards. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Supporting Actress, Best Director, Best Screenplay, right? So we're looking at a movie that has a pretty similar to what we saw today, but that you're probably less likely to have seen. So I want to encourage you to it. It's very different in a lot of ways. It's a film noir rather than a problem picture, as it is. So I encourage you to watch it, and we'll talk about it next week. The way I've designed the class, you'll see that these movies are actually all in pairs. So we can compare and contrast once we see the second movie. So we've got 2 musicals in a little while. We've got everything is sort of in a pair. So feel free to watch them in pairs if you like. Ready for just. And I want to thank you. Thanks for coming out, and hope you enjoyed it. And it's certainly a worthwhile movie. And I think we're going to see interesting classics as we go along.
I
Thank you.
absolutely
Thank
agree
you.
Thank you.
with you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you, Rabbi.
I've seen Gentleman's Agreement. I have not seen Crossfire. I show the kids Gentleman's Agreement, and perhaps I'm going to have another film to show them with Crossfire. So really looking forward to it. If anyone has any questions, comments, or problems, let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I apologize.
Thank you,
My
Rabbi.
internet was a little off. I got slowed down internet message a couple of times, so I apologize if that wasn't strong today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.